Hey everybody, what's going on? I am Gregg Sussman, joined today by Jim Sonis of FanDuel. We're talking NFL draft. You ready, Jim?
I am so ready, Greg, because A, we've had so much time to think about this already, but also it's nice to have actual kind of, I guess, sports to think about. Nothing on the field, but also it is a real sports type event. So a lot of things combining here to make us pretty excited about this, and it's a pretty fun draft class too. So I am jazzed and ready. How are you?
I am excited as well, Jim. I'm just ready for something outside of empty arena wrestling. Listen, I love empty arena wrestling because it's sports, it's wrestling, it gets me away. But the NFL draft, I mean, it's real, man. I am super, super excited. So let's get into it. We're taking a look at some of the props that are available right now over on FanDuel. And the first one you really like is Tristan Wirfs going under pick 8.5. A lot of good offensive linemen in this draft. Wirfs may be the best of them. You get in the under here at minus 152.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of reasons for this. The first one is that there are a lot of tackle-needy teams picking before that 8th overall pick because you've got 4 teams that need a tackle. Now, 2 of them, and the Dolphins and the Chargers, are probably going to go quarterback, so we're going to take them off the table. But that does still leave the Giants and the Cardinals, who are very likely to consider a tackle. We could also see a scenario where the Browns or the Jets trade up to get into the top 7, to trade 2-7 overall with the Panthers to potentially get ahead of the Cardinals and get the tackle of their choice. And those things bode well for Tristan Wirfs. I also like him individually because the athletic testing numbers for Wirfs were unreal. If you look at tackles who have been at the combine since 2010, Wirfs had the 5th best weight-adjusted 40-yard dash time of any tackle in that span. And 2 of the guys who went ahead of him are Lane Johnson and Trent Williams. Both those guys were the 4th overall pick in their respective classes. Terron Armstead was the top guy in that metric, and he wasn't the top-end pick, but he's been a stud. So this is a good number to look at when it comes to tackles. I think that bodes well for Tristan Wirfs. He seems likely to be either the first or the second lineman off the board, and we could see 2 or 3 tackles be taken within these top 8 picks. So I like Wirfs individually, but I also like the way the draft sets up for him to go within those first 8 picks.
I think Tristan Wirfs is probably the Giants' top offensive lineman on their board. You mentioned them at 4. If they don't go with a player like Isaiah Simmons, I think he makes a lot of sense at that spot. And even if they trade down, right, where are they trading down to? Are the Chargers going to try to jump the Dolphins? Are the Dolphins going to make sure that nobody jumps them and they're going to trade up? I think Wirfs makes a lot of sense here. It's not great value at minus 152. It's the offensive tackle heavy draft, as you mentioned, but Wirfs in a good spot to go in the top 8. Let's continue on. I mentioned the Chargers a moment ago, and we talked about how they could draft a quarterback, but what quarterback would they draft? And we all assume that Tua is going to wind up in Miami, and the Chargers are going to take a quarterback, potentially. Who is their quarterback? You're banking your money on Justin Herbert.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to just kind of reset because we've had a lot of smoke coming out over the past couple of months about which teams, who they prefer, which way they are leaning. And I think that that's kind of gotten us distracted from where our baseline assumption was earlier this winter. That was that the Dolphins would take Tua Tagovailoa, whether via trade up or at number 5 overall, and then the Chargers would take Justin Herbert. And I think we kind of got distracted from that because if one of these teams is going to move up to number 3 to take Tua Tagovailoa, the Dolphins have way more ammo than the Chargers do. I think they are more realistic to move up, potentially get Tua, or sit back at 5 and take Tua there. That leaves Herbert available for the Chargers. And it's not a bad scenario for the Chargers to be in if they can sit at number 6 and get the quarterback of their choice. They have a good core around their quarterback, and that means that they can sit there, get their quarterback, and still have the additional draft capital they have available in the rest of the draft. The Dolphins are a team who were tied to Tua Tagovailoa as early as last year, and even an independent medical report said that he has been cleared. I think that this talk around the Dolphins not liking Tua is them trying to drive down the price from the Lions at number 3 overall, or potentially lower the incentive of other teams to jump them in order to draft Tua. So I think that we're just seeing a lot of misdirection here, trying to distract us from what was the previous assumption, was that Tua would go to the Dolphins, Herbert would go to the Chargers, and that allows us to get Herbert at a pretty good number here at plus 160 going to Los Angeles. I could see the Chargers trying to make a play for Tua because Tua, in my eyes at least, is clearly the superior prospect, but I think given the ammo that the Dolphins have and given how long they've been tied to Tua, I think the most likely scenario is the one we had earlier this winter, where the Chargers stay put at 6 and take Herbert there.
I feel like people have forgotten about Justin Herbert through this draft process, and it's possible because everything's being done virtually. We haven't had nearly the coverage that we're used to, but Tua's going to be in Miami. I think every smokescreen that revolves around them not drafting Tua is just that, as you mentioned, Jim, a smokescreen. But for me, Tua's always been the guy from the Dolphins when they were supposed to have the number 1 overall picks, and now we're there at 5. They will do whatever they can with any amount of first-round picks that they have to make sure they get their guy. But Justin Herbert a year ago was going to be the top overall quarterback taken, so we thought, even ahead of Daniel Jones for the Giants, and potentially ahead of Kyler Murray as well. That was Justin Herbert. Now nobody's talking about him. Everyone's talking about Jordan Love instead. We'll get to him in a few moments. But if you still believe that Justin Herbert is the third best quarterback off the board, we know the Chargers are very much in the market for one, not improving the quarterback position after letting Phillip Rivers go. Herbert, you're getting a good number here to go to the Chargers, I believe at plus 160. That's a number you want to take because it's well worth it. We've talked about offensive linemen here, Jim, and you mentioned the Jets. That's your team, and you're saying, hey, they desperately need an offensive lineman. Now, they did do some work in free agency, bringing in a guy like George Font, who is not good, which means they need to draft another offensive lineman, get more talent into the room, and you believe that's the position that they're going to go after here in the first round, and you get pretty good value on that as well.
Yeah, I think the key phrase you said there, Greg, was get more talent in the room. They need to get talent around Sam Darnold because it is year 3 of him on his rookie deal. And that is a critical year for quarterbacks and rookie deals because next offseason they have to decide whether they want to pick up that 5th-year option, and it's the first time they can give him an extension. So if you want to evaluate Sam Darnold, you got to do it this year. And you cannot do that with the offensive line they have around him right now. Like you said, they've made a lot of moves in free agency. They've added a bunch of offensive linemen. But outside of George Fant, all those guys have been interior offensive linemen. Right now, their starting tackles are Fant and Chuma Edoga. You're not going to enter the year with that being the scenario. And I think the way the Jets have attacked free agency has been a signal to me that they plan to address this position in the draft. It also makes sense when you look at the way the draft breaks out because they're going either offensive line or wide receiver with this first pick. I think we can say that pretty definitively. When you look at the depth of this wide receiver class, they can ignore that with this first pick and then address that in the second round. With offensive line, there is a pretty big fall off after either the top 4 or the top 6 tackles, depending on the way that you want to look at things. And I doubt that 6th guy is going to be on the board when the Jets pick in the second round. So if they want to address this thing optimally, with the way the draft is likely to play out, they should go offensive line in the first round, followed by wide receiver in the second round. We know it's probably going to be one of those 2 positions, and they are the top 2 positions at FanDuel Sportsbook, but you're getting plus money on offensive line for Joe Douglas, who is a former offensive lineman and took Andre Dillard in the first round last year with the Philadelphia Eagles. Everything lines up well for them to go offensive line here. I think that the way they've attacked free agency has set them up to do so, and it makes a lot of sense with their needs and their need to evaluate Sam Darnold. Offensive tackle is also a much weaker position for them than wide receiver right now. So I think all the stars align here for the Jets to take a lineman. You're getting plus money on them at plus 110 as well.
I don't think there's any question that they're going to take an offensive lineman. They're getting plus money on this. This is the one I would like to lock in right now before it changes here over at the FanDuel Sportsbook. As you said, Joe Douglas is a former offensive lineman. This is how he wants to build his team. And the only offensive tackle they bring in is George Fant. And again, I'll say it, he's not good at all. Seattle has always desperately needed offensive linemen. They let him walk. Why? Again, because he's not talented. That means they're going to find some talent in the draft, and it's going to be along the offensive line. It's going to be in the first round. There's no doubt in my mind that they're going to not let one of these top offensive linemen slip, and they're going to get him in the first round of the NFL draft. Now, my favorite prop that we're talking about here is right now with Jordan Love. And you believe he's going to go after pick 17, which I think is very, very interesting here, Jim, because there's people that believe that Jordan Love is going to be the 3rd quarterback off the board, potentially to the Los Angeles Chargers. But given that you're betting on Justin Herbert going inside the top 10, going to the Chargers, I know what you're doing, right? You're looking at the rest of the teams in the NFL in that first round. And you're like, oh, well, who else needs a starting quarterback right now? And you don't have one. And then you take a look at some teams that could use a long-term backup, or look at teams that may be in the mix for a starter at some point, and you're like, that's kind of the back end of the first round, maybe in the second round. And that's when you get to Jordan Love. There's a lot of smoke around him. There's a lot of hype around him. But who is going to draft him? That's the question we have to ask ourselves, and that's a reason I have to imagine why you think he goes in the second half of the first round or later.
Yeah, Greg, I think it's kind of what you said, where it's just a numbers game with Jordan Love, where there are two scenarios where Jordan Love goes into the first 17 picks. One of those is he does go the Todd McShay route and become the third quarterback off the board, going ahead of Justin Herbert. But Herbert has a much better statistical profile and, in general, is ranked ahead of Love based on the expert rankings. So I think that scenario is a bit less likely. The betting odds would tell you that as well, because Love is more of a long shot to be drafted ahead of Herbert over at FanDuel Sportsbook. The other scenario where Jordan Love goes in the first 17 picks is where we have a surprise team taking a quarterback. That could be Washington or Jacksonville. But Washington has traded for Kyle Allen, and they've kind of ignored Cam Newton, which says to me they're probably not in the market at quarterback and probably proceeding forward with Dwayne Haskins. The alternative is the Jaguars, and the Jaguars pick at 9. They could go a quarterback there, but they also have a pick later in the first round at pick number 19. They could look at the draft board and say, hey, there's no other quarterback needy team between our first pick and our second pick within the first round, because the next team that needs a quarterback on the board is the Patriots all the way down at pick 23. So if a team decides, hey, we want Jordan Love, they can either jump ahead of the Jaguars at 19 or they could jump ahead of the Patriots at 23, but neither of those scenarios requires them to pick within the top 17 picks. So I think that although we do have two paths to Jordan Love being a top 17 pick, I don't think either path is all that likely, which means getting the over here at just minus 102, I think is pretty attractive. Jordan Love is pretty much a lock, I would say, to be a first-round pick, and that's totally okay. You know, maybe a team trades back into the first round to get him at the end there, but there are enough red flags, I think, to push him outside the back or the front half of the first round and back to those quarterback-needy teams you mentioned in the latter half of the first round. So I'm going to go over here at minus 102 and say that we see a fall on Love because it's just a numbers game that doesn't work in his favor.
Jim, I like how you broke that down even further for us. Try to figure out where he would end up, and the only two likely teams are the Patriots and the Jaguars, and both have picks towards the end of that first round after pick number 17, which is where you're getting them at plus 102. I will say this, as a Giants fan, watching the Giants have two first-round picks and using their early one in Daniel Jones, you don't want to miss it. If you absolutely love a quarterback, you go up and you take him wherever you need to. Jaguars could do that inside the top 10. I think that's the biggest fear. I don't see anyone going up after that. If the Jaguars let him fall then, I think you're safe. I think that's the one pick you got to worry about is the Jaguars' early pick. We'll see what happens. We'll see if Jordan Love could pull that Todd McShay, as you mentioned, be the third quarterback off the board or potentially a top 10 quarterback. But a plus 102, I think it's worth taking the shot. And he'll go after pick 17. Along with a lot of really good offensive linemen here on the board, Jim, there's a lot of good wide receivers on the board as well. And that leaves T. Higgins, well, potentially out of the first round. You don't think so, and I don't really think so either. He had a great career at Clemson, and T. Higgins, in any other draft, maybe the first wide receiver off the board. That's how talented I think he is. You're buying that some team will take the plunge on T. Higgins in round one.
Yeah, I think T. Higgins and literally every wide receiver in this draft has benefited from the way that things have played out so far in this offseason. It started with the trades because the Minnesota Vikings traded away Stephon Diggs and acquired another first-round pick. That adds another pick for a wide receiver-needy team in this first round. They're not going to go into the year with Adam Thielen and Olabisi Johnson as their top two receivers. They're going to draft a wide receiver with one of those first two picks. But also, we saw the San Francisco 49ers pick up number 13 overall in that DeForest Buckner trade with the Indianapolis Colts. They're pretty likely to draft a wide receiver with one of their first picks as well. So what we've seen here is a couple of wide receiver needy teams add first-round picks, which inflates the number of projected first-round picks to be used on wide receivers. There have also been some teams that haven't made a lot of moves in free agency, specifically the Packers. They did add Devin Funchess, but overall, they haven't done enough to address that wide receiver position. We could see them be in play for a wide receiver at pick number 30. That just increases the number of projected wide receivers in the first round, which means that someone like T. Higgins, who, like you said, had a tremendous career at Clemson, could sneak back into that first round at the latter half just because there are so many teams that could address wide receiver in this first round. Now, yeah, T. Higgins' pro day wasn't that good. His 40-yard dash time wasn't great. He rested at the combine and probably is going to cost himself a couple of picks there as a result. But you can trust the tape here. You can trust the size. You can trust everything that we saw him do at Clemson. I think that's going to get him back into the first round, especially when we're getting him at plus money at plus 126. I think you're really banking on a major fall here from T. Higgins just because he did not work out at the combine and had kind of poor numbers in his pro day. I think that T. Higgins is going to slide up into that first round because of the Vikings and 49ers adding first-round picks, inflating the number of wide receivers who go in the first round. He's one of those guys who could benefit. So trying to see where the dominoes fall and which players benefit from that, I think that T. Higgins at plus money makes a lot of sense to go in the first based on the way things have played out throughout this offseason.
We'll see what happens. There's a lot of teams in the first round, as you mentioned, need offensive linemen and wide receivers. The Packers and the Vikings, two teams in the NFC North that could become viable options for T. Higgins. Like you said, he didn't help himself necessarily at the NFL Combine, but he very well could sneak into the first round with so many wide receiver needy teams and that career on tape at Clemson. A lot of these players this year, given the tough offseason, are just like, hey, look at my tape. Look at what I do when the games matter. Forget me in shorts. T. Higgins, well, he can put up his game tape against anybody. One last prop to get to on today's edition of the Hurry Up, and that brings us, well, right back to the quarterback position. We've talked about arguably the top 4 quarterbacks on the board, but what happens after that? Jake Fromm had a nice career at Georgia. Jacob Eason had a good career as well. Well, who's going to go first? Jim, you're banking on it being Jake Fromm. How come?
Well, I think we've already seen the scenario play out once before. That was when Georgia picked Jake Fromm over Jacob Eason, and I think that the NFL could follow suit. Now, you can't really appeal to authority here because Georgia pretty clearly made a mistake when they had Justin Fields transfer. That one didn't work out as well. So saying that because Georgia picked Jake Fromm over Jacob Eason is not going to be a lone convincing factor to say that the NFL will do the same here. But there are also other reasons to favor Jake Fromm over Jacob Eason. The first one is that Fromm is a year younger than Jacob Eason with 15 more games in college of at least 10 pass attempts. And those are numbers that are important when predicting whether quarterbacks will pan out at the NFL level. So younger, more experienced, that's good for Fromm. He also was better in college because his adjusted yards per attempt as a junior, Jake Fromm's at Georgia, was 8.1. That was not very good, but it was still better than Jacob Eason's at 8.0, and Fromm was above 9.5 the 2 years before that as a true freshman and a true sophomore playing in the SEC. So he was a good college quarterback, and Jacob Eason never had a year on par with those 2 years from Jake Fromm. Fromm also did that despite a much tougher schedule playing in the SEC. 78% of his passes this year came against top 50 defenses based on Bill Connolly's numbers SP Plus at ESPN. That's compared to just 36% for Jacob Eason. So Fromm had better efficiency numbers while facing a tougher schedule. He is younger. He is more experienced. We've already seen a team pick Jake Fromm over Jacob Eason in the past. I understand why Jacob Eason is the favorite here. You're getting Fromm at plus money at plus 120 because Fromm at the combine did not look good, but there wasn't a lot of positive buzz out of Jacob Eason there. So I think if you're betting Jake Fromm relative to Jordan Love, Jalen Hurts, and guys like that, it's okay to have pessimism, but specifically around Jacob Eason, I want to side with Jake Fromm here. I want to trust the college numbers. I want to trust the pedigree and the experience and what we've seen in the past, and that's with Jake Fromm being a guy who was favored over Jacob Eason.
He's done it once before. Why can't he do it again? In the battle of the Jakes for Georgia, Georgia went with Jake Fromm over Jacob Eason. Eason had a nice college career, but as you mentioned, Fromm is younger and had more games where those higher pass attempts. I have to like Jake Fromm to do it. Remember, as a freshman, we thought this guy was going to be the number 1 overall pick. Didn't necessarily turn out that way for Jake Fromm, who's going to go somewhere in the middle of this draft. But Fromm, he's very, very talented, as is Jacob Eason. And we'll see if Fromm will go over him again, just like he did at Georgia. But I think the youth is on his side. So the numbers, they're on his side as well. Like you said, neither player really lit the combine up. And it's not necessarily about the combine for the quarterback. It's about what he did in college. He's got that cerebral mind. I think Jake Fromm, certainly somebody at his age, at his youth, that should go over Jacob Eason. It's plus money, a little bit anyway, from a solid choice. That's going to do it for us here on the FanDuel Hurry Up. Jim, we appreciate your time. Hopefully we'll do this soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it, Greg. It's been fun to reconnect here a little bit, at least virtually, and hopefully we can get some more draft talk in here pretty quickly and just enjoy having something to talk about in the sporting world. Hopefully we can have real sports to talk about in the not-so-distant future.
I'm petrified what happens after the NFL draft, because then I'm like, now what, Jim? But hopefully by then we'll have something else to talk about. I'm sure they'll be able to drive cars around circles again for you soon.
I can only hope. That would be the best thing ever at this point. Give me some NASCAR. Give me anything. I will watch literally whatever to get my mind off of all the stuff going on in the world. So whatever it is, I will happily take it, Greg.
For Jim Sanas, I'm Gregg Sussman. Thanks so much for watching the FanDuel Hurry Up. We'll see you again later this week. Have a great week. Stay safe, everybody.